There's a story told about a man who was driving down in a car with his little daughter, and the windows were down, and a bee flew in the car, and the little girl was deathly allergic to bees. Seriously, she was stung with a bee. She could die within 30 minutes to an hour. Terrified, she began to swat in the air and cry out and scream. She was in terror because of the bee that was in there. And finally her dad realized it, and he slowed down the car, and he saw the bee as he pulled the car over the side of the edge of the road, and he put his hand up, and he tracked the bee between the windshield and his hand. And then, to the utter surprise of the little girl, he moved his hand away, and the bee continued to fly around in the car. She's terrified. Daddy, Daddy, why didn't you kill the bee? Daddy, Daddy, the bee's going to kill me. And the father turned to the daughter and said, don't worry about it, honey. He said, I've taken the sting out of the bee. And he held out his hand, and she could still see the writhing stinger that was stuck in his palm. She didn't do anything to earn it. She didn't do anything to deserve it. But he took the sting away. And folks, that's exactly what Christ has done for us. He looked at you and saw that you don't deserve anything that he would do. And yet he took the sting from Satan away. And sometimes we're still running around terrified of him. And we don't need to be. Because we have God's grace. Would you say that's cool? Yeah. But there's another precious gift that he's given to us. We need to remember what we have. Not only God's grace, but we have God's peace. God's peace. This amazing, calm assurance that God has his hand on your world. Peace is this calm assurance that God has his hand on your world. Jesus said in John 16, verse 33, I have told you all this so that you may have peace in me. Here on this earth, you will have many trials and sorrows. Can I get a witness to that? It's tough here. And Jesus said, but take heart, because I have overcome this world. He said, I got it under control. I've got it all under control. I've got my hand on it. Do you realize that there's nothing that happens in this world that makes God surprised? There's nothing that God happens in your life or in this world that God goes, I didn't know that was going to happen. You lose your job. I didn't know that was going to happen. Doctor gives you a bad prognosis. I didn't know that was going to happen. There's nothing in this world that happens that God isn't fully apprised of and aware of before it happens. It may surprise you. It doesn't surprise God. And he's already got it under control. He's already got his hand on everything. He will either put his hand to shield us or he'll put his hand to guide us as we go through the trials that we're facing. You remember the song that we used to sing as kids? He's got the whole world in his hand. He's got the whole wide world in his hand. And we don't sing it today because that's a kid's song, but maybe we should sing it today. Especially when you're going through a time of trial and trouble. Maybe you need to sing today that reminder that God's got the whole world in his hand. And he's got you in his hand. And that there's no reason for you to be afraid because of the calm assurance, the peace of Christ, the calm assurance that God has his hand on your world. I love the way the Message paraphrase renders this verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13. It says, no test or temptation that comes your way is beyond the course of what others have had to face. In other words, there are other people in the world who have had to go through what you're going through. And then he says this, all you need to remember is, read with me, that God will never let you down, and, here we go, he'll never let you be pushed past your limit, and, here we go, he'll always be there to help you come through it. There's nothing you go through that God doesn't have his hand on. Nothing. In fact, in verse 5, Peter says that we have been shielded by God's power. When you go through times of trial, you need to remember what you have. You need to remember God's grace and God's peace. And you need to remember your living hope. We've been given a living hope. Paul says an inheritance that can never, or Peter says, an inheritance can never perish, spoil, or fade, and it's kept in heaven for you. You see, there's nothing that you go through here in this world that is comparable with the glory that is going to happen. The worst of the troubles that you're facing right here and now are incomparable with the glory that will be in heaven. The most heartache and tumultuous time that you're dealing with right now in heaven will all seem minuscule and not important. That's what Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17. He says, for our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. What you're dealing with here now is inconsequential when you realize the joy and the glory that is inexhaustible in heaven. And that's waiting for us. And sometimes we fix our sight so much on what we're going through right now that we lose sight of that which is awaiting for us in glory. So looking at things from the eternal perspective can make all the difference in the world when you're going through times of trouble or times of trial. There's an old story that's told by Fred Craddock, a professor of preaching at one of the seminaries in the Midwest. And he told that he and his wife were driving through the countryside of Tennessee early one morning, and they stopped at a little diner for breakfast in a small little town. And he said when they went in and sat down, they saw that the diner was pretty full, and there was an old man who was just kind of wandering around the cafe talking to people. And Fred said he didn't want to break the peace that he and his wife were enjoying. And so he said, I was hoping that this old man would not come and talk at our table. But he moved around through the cafe talking, glad-handing people. And Fred said, as I was watching, sure enough, here he came right down to my table. And he said, the old man stood there for a minute, and he said, how you doing? And we said, we're fine. He said, are you just live here now, or are you just passing through or staying? I said, we're just passing through. He said, well, where do you, what's your name? And he said, I'm Fred Craddock. He said, my name is Ben Hooper. He said, well, that's nice to meet you, Ben. He said, thank you so much for coming by. And he said, let me ask you. He said, what do you do for a living, Fred? And he said, well, I'm a professor. I teach preaching. He said, you're a preacher. He said, let me tell you some stories. And he grabbed the chair and pulled it up to the end of the counter. He said, let me tell you a story. He said, when I was a boy, when I was born to, I didn't have a daddy when I was born. He said, my mommy didn't marry my daddy. In fact, she wouldn't even tell me who my daddy was. And he said, back there in these hills, if you didn't have a daddy, you were considered a nobody. People shunned you, and they laughed at you. And he said when we'd go into town, they'd laugh at my mommy, and they'd say, there goes that boy who doesn't have a daddy. When I went to school, the kids wouldn't play with me because it was like I had some kind of stink on me that they didn't want to get on them. He said when we went to town, people would shun us. They would laugh at us. He said it was a hard life. Nobody would play with me. We lived in the hills. He said we had a little country church that had preaching every other weekend. He said my mama wouldn't go because they wouldn't let her in the doors, but I would go. And he said I would come in late because I didn't want people looking at me or staring or saying anything, and I would leave early because of the ridicule that I'd receive. He said one Sunday I snuck in, and we had a new preacher, somebody we'd never seen before. And his sermon was so short that I couldn't get out the door before he did. And he was standing out when I came out. And as he was standing there, he walked over to me, and he put his hand on my head and tousled my hair. And he said, I know whose boy you are. And I looked at him with wonder in my eyes, and he said, you're a son of God. He said, son, never forget the amazing inheritance that is yours and live up to it. Ben Hooper said, I never forgot those words. I realized for the very first time in my life, I had a daddy. He wasn't a daddy here. He was a daddy up there who loved me and died for me. And I've lived my entire life trying to make him happy and to please him. Thanks for listening to my story, he said. He got up from his chair and returned it back to its table and left the cafe. Fred Craddock said that he and his wife just sat there, stunned. When someone else from the cafe came over and said, do you know who that was? And they said, no. He said, that's Ben Hooper. They said, who's Ben Hooper? He said, Ben Hooper was the former governor of the state of Tennessee. See, you never know what strength you will have. You'll never know what is within you until you realize what you have from Christ. That you have grace. You don't deserve it. You haven't earned it. But God gives it to you. You have peace. God controlling the things going on around you, giving you guidance, helping you go through your life. And you have a precious living hope that can never be taken away from you. And when we remember that we have grace and peace and a living hope, it will help us hold on to that golden faith that God wants to produce in our lives. Well, there's a third thing that Peter adds. He says, when the hot time comes, remember your heart and your head. When the hot times come, remember your heart and your head.